Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Joyce Coleman, Executive Director of the Vasculitis Foundation, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Welcome to Vasculitis Awareness Month 2016. We are glad you could join us today. Today's speaker is Dr. Carol Langford. From 1994 to 2004, Dr. Langford was a senior investigator within the Immunologic Diseases section of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health. At the NIH, Dr. Langford's research focused on vasculitic diseases, where she was principal investigator for 9 vasculitis-related protocols. In 2004, Dr. Langford joined the Cleveland Clinic to become director of the Center for Vasculitis Care and Research. She is an associate professor of medicine of the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine of Case Western Reserve University and was named vice chair of rheumatology for research in 2007. At Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Langford's work focuses on patient care and research in vasculitic diseases, including GPA Wegener's, MPA, EGPA Shirk-Strauss, polyarteritis nodosa, giant cell arteritis, Takayasu's arteritis, and other forms of vasculitis. In 2007, she was awarded an important research contract from the NIH for concurrent pilot studies in GCA and Takayasu's arteritis. She has additionally received funding from the Rare Diseases Clinical Research Network of the NIH to conduct a pilot study in GPA Wegener's that has led to a multi-center international randomized trial. This study will be conducted in partnership with the colleagues in the Vasculitis Clinical Research Consortium, a collaborative research network funded by the NIH and the European Vasculitis Society. Dr. Langford is an active member of the American College of Rheumatology, where she serves on several committees. She was an associate editor for Arthritis and Rheumatology, a leading journal in rheumatology from 2000 to 2005. Dr. Langford also serves as a consultant to the Vasculitis Foundation, and she has been named one of Cleveland's top doctors by Cleveland Magazine. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Langford.
Thank you, Joyce. It's truly a pleasure and a privilege to be here with everyone today and to be sharing in this very important 30th anniversary of the Vasculitis Foundation. As Joyce mentioned, my journey in vasculitis began in 1994, which dates back 22 years. So in all of that time, the Vasculitis Foundation has been a very important part of my world, and I have been a part of theirs for all except the first 8 years. So it's truly been a wonderful partnership, and it's a pleasure to be able to provide today's lecture. So we're here today really in recognition and, frankly, celebration for what the Vasculitis Foundation has accomplished over the past 30 years. And as part of this celebration, what we're going to be discussing today is a brief history of vasculitis, where we've come from in the past 30 years, and what lies ahead for the next 30 years and beyond. If we were to talk about the entire history of vasculitis, I could very easily be here for many hours, if not days or weeks. So this will be, in many ways, a personal reflection about what has been very significant in the field of vasculitis and significant to me as well. Many of these time points, again, we will not be able to discuss for every disease and for every significant scientist who's made a contribution. So I do want to recognize that there are many people in our field who have been very significant but who will not be touched on today, and there's no way to diminish the importance of their work to our field. So as we know, vasculitis is very much a family of diseases that are linked by the presence of blood vessel inflammation. Diseases of the blood vessel really date back as far as past antiquity can count, but really the first complete description of a vasculitis was made only 150 years ago. At that time in 1866, the scientists Kussmaul and Meyer provided the first detailed description of a young man with vasculitis who had nodular changes of his arteries, as you can see on this detailed drawing of as there were no cameras back then, of an illness that they recognized to be unique and which they named periarteritis nodosa. Over the next period of time, we can see within the medical literature the description of individual vasculitic diseases, again recognizing that for some of these we can find earlier descriptions, but that were not as well outlined. And initially, though, even though these are now recognized to be unique diseases, all forms of vasculitis were considered under the name of periarteritis or polyarteritis nodosa. In 1952, Pearl Zeek made a seminal contribution in recognizing that there were indeed unique forms of vasculitis, and she proposed the first classification system for vasculitis. In the 1950s, it was not easy for women to become scientists, and I think this is part of the reason for me that this resonates as such an important contribution in our field. This was also important because it allowed us to start to recognize that because there were unique clinical features, there were also potentially unique aspects in terms of treatment. So what about treatment of vasculitis? In 1948, one of the seminal contributions, not only in vasculitis, but in medicine in general, was made with the discovery of cortisone, which is the backbone of prednisone and other glucocorticoid medications. At that time, scientists Kendall and Hench at the Mayo Clinic were working in this field and conducted the first studies with the use of cortisone in people with rheumatoid arthritis, noticing dramatic improvements. This was such an important contribution that in 1950, these scientists, together with the chemist Thaddeus Reichstein from Switzerland, were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Not surprisingly, therefore, these studies stretched to the treatment of vasculitis, and scientists again at the Mayo Clinic first began to use cortisone on patients who had periarteritis nodosa and cranial arteritis. These studies continued, and towards the latter 1950s, we recognized that cortisone not only improved the symptoms of giant cell arteritis, but very importantly, it provided protection against the loss of eyesight. These studies in giant cell arteritis continued at the Mayo Clinic throughout the 60s, 70s, and to this very date. And we can see here Professor Gene Hunder, who has had a very important role in the history of vasculitis, and some of his work within the field of what was then known as temporal arteritis in recognizing the clinical features and also refinements in treatment. However, it was mentioned and recognized during that period of time that unfortunately prednisone was not the answer for many forms of vasculitis. And in particular, the illness of granulomatosis with polyangiitis, or as it was known then, Wegener's granulomatosis, was an untreatable illness until 1973, when scientist Anthony Fauci and his mentor Sheldon Wolf at the NIH described their experience with the use of cyclophosphamide, Cytoxan, and prednisone in patients with GPA. This led to studies extending into the early 1980s, recognizing now that GPA became a treatable illness. And we can see in this series that, very importantly, 93% of people were able to achieve remission or a lack of disease activity. Relapses did occur, and at that point in time, there was a favorable safety experience. This was also an important period with the work of Dr. Fauci and his colleagues at the NIH in not only looking at treatment options, but trying to understand why these therapies worked, and in doing so, trying to understand more about the causes of these diseases. And we can see here some of the papers published with his colleagues during this early period, laying the foundation for the importance of laboratory studies in understanding the causes of disease. During this same time, work was going on in other laboratories throughout the world. An important discovery was made about anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibodies, or ANCA. These were first described in a one-page paper that appeared in the British Medical Journal in 1982. And 3 years later, Dr. Foucault van de Woude made a seminal observation of the association of these antibodies with Wegener's granulomatosis and their presence with disease activity. That then brings us to the founding of the Wegener's Granulomatosis Association in 1986. This organization was founded by Marilyn Sampson, a nurse who herself had Wegener's granulomatosis, recognizing the many challenges faced by people with this illness and the questions and concerns faced by them and their families in trying to provide support and knowledge about this illness. So where did things stand with the founding of the Wegener's Granulomatosis Association in 1996? What did we know and what was going on? Well, at that point, we had identified most, but not all forms of vasculitis. As I mentioned, ANCA had been described, but still very little was known about this. Almost nothing was still known about the causes of vasculitis. We had one treatment for giant cell arteritis with Prednisone. We had one treatment for GPA, which was Prednisone combined with cyclophosphamide. And very important studies were being done in vasculitis, but largely at single medical centers throughout the world. So as we launched then into the latter 90s and onwards, the investigation of ANCA continued to grow. And with this, we came to understand the proteins that these antibodies were responding to with the work of Ronald Falk and Charles Jeanette at the University of North Carolina with the identification of myeloperoxidase ANCA, and the work of John Niles at the Massachusetts General Hospital with the identification of proteinase 3 ANCA. Work was going on indeed throughout the world in the investigation of these antibodies, including in the Netherlands with Kees Kalenberg and Jan Willem Cohen-Terwert, in Germany with Professor Wolfgang Gross, and at the Mayo Clinic with Ulrich Specks and his mentor, Richard de Remy. With this body of work going on throughout the world, the first ANCA workshop was held in 1988 in Copenhagen in Denmark. This was led by Niels Rasmussen and Alan Wieck, and this was attended by 35 scientists who provided 11 invited talks and 18 abstracts. And I'll have you keep this in mind as far as when we talk about where we are in current day. Work was also continuing in vasculitis at the NIH, and we can see here Dr. Gary Hoffman played a very important role in our field. And he continued the work of Dr. Fauci in trying to understand the treatment of cyclophosphamide and what this meant for patients moving forward in long term. While this continued to demonstrate that cyclophosphamide was very much a life-saving and important therapy, it led us to recognize that this was not the final answer. For although we saw that remission induction continued in a very high percentage of people, relapses occurred and people were experiencing side effects as a result of treatment. So we knew that we needed to seek other answers. This led to the exploration of methotrexate in GPA, recognizing that there was a spectrum of illness, including non-severe disease, for which the use of methotrexate was found to be an effective therapy. We also continued to refine the use of cyclophosphamide through the use of staged treatment approaches, where we began to view the use of treatment as far as active disease or induction, where that active disease was put into remission, followed by remission maintenance. And based on the favorable experience with methotrexate, we explored the use of methotrexate for maintenance after cyclophosphamide, and in doing so allowed a much shorter duration of cyclophosphamide exposure than had previously been possible. With the identification that there were now options that we may have for people, we needed to understand if option A or option B was better. And also we needed to work together in trying to identify methods within the laboratory that could involve large numbers of people. This led to the development of collaborative research networks in vasculitis. One of the first being the International Network for the Study of the Systemic Vasculitis, started by Dr. Gary Hoffman, and concurrently the development of the European Vasculitis Society and the French Vasculitis Study Group. As scientists were now working together, we needed to have common language about what terms we were going to use for these illnesses that were going to be placed into study. This led to the development of classification and nomenclature systems dating back to 1990 by the American College of Rheumatology with the ACR criteria for the classification of vasculitis, and then with the Chapel Hill Consensus Conference for the nomenclature of the systemic vasculitides. These provided standardized names and definitions for vasculitis through which diseases could be categorized for studies, so we knew that when we were performing studies that these would be similar individuals with similar features in assessing their responses to treatment. In doing so, we needed to understand how were they responding to treatment, or were these treatment effective, and we needed to better define what we meant by terms such as remission, relapse, active disease, and damage. This led to the development of instruments to score these systems with the Birmingham Vasculitis Activity Score, first put into place in Birmingham, England by Professor Paul Bacon and Rashid Luqmani, and also scoring of scarring or damage by the damage indices. This again provided standardized tools through which disease activity, remission, relapse, and damage could be scored within clinical studies to better allow us to understand the effectiveness of medications. At the same time, studies in giant cell arteritis were continuing to progress at the Mayo Clinic. This included work by Eric Matteson studying how people did over time with giant cell arteritis, the recognition of large vessel features affecting the aorta, and what those complications may be. There was also work by colleagues within the laboratory, here with Cornelia Ryan and Jörg Garanzi, initially at Mayo and now at Stanford University, trying to understand the mechanisms taking place within the blood vessel and in turn the causes of vasculitis. Similar work was also taking place in Europe, here with work by Maria Sid and colleagues, also studying the mechanisms of giant cell arteritis. We also recognized that even though we were at the dawn of the millennium, it was never too late to learn and see new things. This included the description of single-organ vasculitis and idiopathic aortitis, IgG4-related aortitis, and ongoing studies of central nervous system vasculitis, including with my colleagues Rula Hajali and Leonard Calabrese at Cleveland Clinic. This was a very important period also for the growth of patient advocacy through the Wegener's Granulomatosis Association, extending their portfolio not only through education and family support, but also into the area of research. And we can see here Dr. Nabi Abdu, who played a very important role in the early days of the formation of the Wegener's Granulomatosis Association, and one of the first studies that was a direct result of advocacy and participation of people with vasculitis, which was a survey of 701 patients in North America with Wegener's granulomatosis in understanding the changes of outcome during the 1990s. This was also a very important period in 2005 when the WGA became the Vasculitis Foundation, now extending the reach to all forms of vasculitis in broadening our perspective and really understanding the shared similarities between these diseases and how we can perform more and be able to work more together in understanding their causes and be able to support work in these important diseases. During this period, we also saw the first comparative study conducted in any form of vasculitis, which was the study of methotrexate in giant cell arteritis led by Gary Hoffman. This was the first study to be conducted in multiple medical centers which compared two different treatments in any form of vasculitis and led the way for what was to follow. Similarly, comparative studies were also performed in GPA, and this was a very seminal study published in 2003 in the New England Journal of Medicine, comparing cyclophosphamide to azathioprine for remission maintenance, which was led by David Jane of the European Vasculitis Society. There were also other multi-center comparative trials that took place. So we can see here the comparison of cyclophosphamide to methotrexate for non-severe disease, led by Kristen de Groot. She also conducted a study comparing daily intermittent cyclophosphamide, comparisons of methotrexate to azathioprine for maintenance, led by Christian Pagnu, now in Toronto, Canada. Comparisons of azathioprine and mycophenolate mofetil by Heimstra, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and also initial studies of plasmapheresis by Dr. Jane. During this period, there was also very important growth of the collaborative network in France, led at that time by Loïc Guillavin, and we can see here some of his seminal studies in polyarteritis nodosa and EGPA-Churg-Strauss syndrome. The millennium was also a very important time in medicine because of the widespread more development of biologic agents. So how did these treatments work, and why was this such an important contribution in how we are now looking at treatment of immunologic diseases in medicine? The immune system is a very complex system and is something we are continuing to learn more about every day that passes. Our immune system is what recognizes ourself from things that are not ourself and is composed of cells, proteins that do the work of this important recognition. Our conventional immunosuppressive medications, such as prednisone, cytoxan, and methotrexate, have very broad effects on all of the components of the immune system. And while these can therefore be beneficial for inflammatory diseases like vasculitis, it also means that other important functions of the immune system, such as providing protection against infection, may also be impacted. What biologic or targeted immunosuppressive medications do is they specifically focus on an individual component of our immune system, such as T cells, B cells, potentially the downstream effect of B cells or their interplay of T cells. But the first biologic agents to be explored in vasculitis were what are referred to as the TNF inhibitors, which affect cytokines or proteins within our immune system. Etanercept was one of the first biologic agents to be introduced in medicine and was the first biologic agent used in rheumatoid arthritis. Based on how this worked, it all became the first biologic agent to be explored in vasculitis. And this was studied in granulomatosis with polyangiitis. And although this was unfortunately a negative study, it was very important and significant in demonstrating the first comparative study of any biologic agent in this disease and where we were going in moving forwards. The ability to demonstrate that multi-system and multi-center studies could not only be conducted in vasculitis, but could be conducted very successfully, led to the development and funding of the Vasculitis Clinical Research Consortium by the NIH in 2004. This is led by Peter Merkel, initially at Boston University and now at the University of Pennsylvania. And the VCRC has since undergone successful new renewals in 2009 and 2014. This network is engaged in research understanding the causes and treatment of vasculitis, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, with colleagues participating in these important studies. Although the Etanercept trial did not provide benefit in GPA, by no means did we lose interest in exploring these very exciting therapies. The first study of Rituximab was conducted by Ulrich Specks and published in 2001 with a very seminal case report with his use of Rituximab in a patient who had had resistant GPA that had been intolerant to other therapies. Following the benefit of this therapy in this individual, this led to open-label and compassionate studies of Rituximab that were similarly favorable results were seen. This then led to large comparative studies comparing rituximab to cyclophosphamide in patients with severe GPA and microscopic polyangiitis. And in 2010, in the same New England Journal of Medicine, the European RetuxVash trial and the RAVE trial were published. Both of these series and studies demonstrated the effectiveness of rituximab and that it was as effective as cyclophosphamide for patients who had severe GPA or MPA. This then led to a very important finding and awarding, which was the first ever Food and Drug Administration approval for treatment for any form of vasculitis. So although we had had for many years medications that were standard of care in terms of prednisone and cyclophosphamide, this for the first time represented an FDA-approved treatment, which opened the door in many ways for interest and support of the exploration of further treatments that could be beneficial in the treatment of vasculitis. In the next 6-year period leading up to current day, we have continued to explore new medications, and we can see here publications with the use of Abatacept in a pilot study of GPA, and just recently the publication of a phase 2 study of tocilizumab in giant cell arteritis. We have also continued to refine our naming and nomenclature of the vasculitic diseases as our knowledge about them have continued to grow. And this was the most recent version of the Chapel Hill Consensus Conference, again held in Chapel Hill, with the renaming of several forms of vasculitic disease based on new discoveries. We've also started to see very exciting work within the field of genetics within vasculitis, including these publications in the New England Journal of Medicine, which lead us for great excitement for what this holds for the future. So where we are today in 2016, as you recall, I mentioned the very first ANCA workshop that was held in 1988. Just last year, we held the 17th International ANCA and Vasculitis Workshop in London, England, that was attended by over 200, 300 scientists with many publications of abstracts of original research work and over 27 original lectures. We have also continued to see the growth of basic and translational science in laboratories throughout the world, both in individual labs and what is being conducted within our research consortium, including now the Canadian Vasculitis group, CANVAS. We have also seen the development of studies within diagnosis and outcome measures, including the DC-VAS study, in which the Vasculitis Foundation has had a very important role in funding, as well as recognition of the importance of patient-reported outcomes. And we have seen a wide range of clinical trials of new medications in a diverse range of vasculitic diseases, including seen here the TAPER trial, trying to understand the role of low-dose prednisone in remission maintenance. A very important contribution to where we are going in research, and I think is in recognition of the Vasculitis Foundation and of the wide reach of what we can do together, and particularly in our electronic age, has been the Vasculitis Patient-Powered Research Network, also funded through the NIH and with partnership of the VCRC. And I would encourage everyone to go on the web to learn more about this very important research initiative. So where are we now in 2016? Well, I think in the 30 years that the Vasculitis Foundation has been with us, we have seen tremendous growth. At this point, really all forms of vasculitis are potentially treatable, and for many forms of vasculitis, we have treatment options. Vasculitis, while still being a very problematic and severe illness, is one that can be a very chronic illness as well, and where we are not just looking at what we are facing now, but projecting what that means for people 20, 30, 40, 50 years and beyond. And as you've seen from the body of work that I presented, there are dedicated investigators and research networks who are working together with our patient advocates to better understand vasculitis. Just as examples from where we've come from, in 1986 for the treatment of GPA, MPA, ANCA-associated vasculitis, what we had was cyclophosphamide and prednisone. In 2016, we can see some of the diversity of options that we have in considering for the treatment of our patients. For giant cell arteritis in 1986, we had prednisone, and while that remains the foundation of treatment in 2016, just in 2015, we have seen encouraging results published in abstracts, and as I just showed you recently, the publication with the phase 2 study of tocilizumab and the phase 2 study of Abatacept. So even though this has been very encouraging, we do recognize that there remains much that we have yet to do. We do not yet know the cause of most forms of vasculitis, and that is something that is very important to us, to people with vasculitis and their families. We also know that many forms of vasculitis can relapse, and in so doing cause potential concerns. Organ damage and treatment side effects remain a problem for people, and many people do not feel how they used to with vasculitis, and that's not something we diminish in any way. And most importantly, we do not yet have a cure, which remains our bottom line goal in all instances. So what are the keys to continue our growth in the knowledge in vasculitis? Research would not, we would not be where we are today without research in vasculitis. And this has included a partnership of laboratory-based research together with clinical research in very much a bench-to-bedside approach. None of the research that I presented today would, of course, be possible without the enthusiasm and participation in those who have been involved in those research studies at all levels. Unfortunately, studies do cost money, and funding has been a very important part of where our research has moved. And while I think we all recognize that there is not as much funding as we would all like, and there have been challenges in recent years, there have also been ways in which these challenges have been met, and very important ways in which that research has been advanced. This includes from multiple fronts, from our federal governments throughout the world, from industry, and certainly through very important philanthropic partnerships with private organizations and with organizations like the Vasculitis Foundation. None of us are getting any younger, and the training of our next generation for new ideas is critically important. I am very pleased and honored to work with the Vasculitis Foundation for the awarding in 2016 of the Gary S. Hoffman Vasculitis Foundation Fellowship. And again, we see here Dr. Hiromichi Tamaki with Dr. Hoffman. This was provided very generously by the Vasculitis Foundation in recognition of the contributions of Dr. Hoffman to the vasculitis world. And we are very grateful to the Vasculitis Foundation to be training this young individual here at Cleveland. This, of course, would be not possible without the collaboration and teamwork that's occurred. And I think one of the things that has been so gratifying to me as part of the vasculitis community has been the many wonderful colleagues and friends that I've met in this field and the work that we have conducted. And although this is not unique to vasculitis, I think we do have a very special group of individuals who are very committed to trying to advance our knowledge in these diseases and to make the lives of people with vasculitis better, both in understanding, treating, and curing vasculitis. And this work will continue throughout the world as we move forward. So, as I've hoped to highlight today, the Vasculitis Foundation has had a very important place in history. If we look at some of this timeline of some of the firsts, and again, these are by no means the only ones, But if we put in place as far as when the WGA and now vasculitis was first founded, I think looking at these timeline, one of the things I can't help but be struck by is what has happened in the last 30 years as compared to the 120 years prior, and what that might mean in terms of excitement and advancement for what the next 30 years might bring. As I mentioned, this was a personal journey for me, and I didn't feel it was fair to be showing these pictures of other people without being a part of that. And 30 years, time does indeed go by. This is a picture of Joyce Coleman and I from one of the then WGA symposium held sometime prior to 2000. And for those of you who don't know what I look like now, the hair color has changed a bit, but the enthusiasm for helping people with vasculitis certainly has not. So again, I want to join with everyone in congratulating the Vasculitis Foundation for the past 30 years, which have been truly amazing, and thanking them for everything they have brought to the field of vasculitis in helping people both at a very individual level and helping people throughout the world with these challenging illnesses. And again, we've seen tremendous growth over the past 30 years, and I can't wait to see what the next 30 bring. So again, thank you to everyone for inviting me to be here with you today. Joyce will be giving me as far as your questions. Please write into those, and we'll try and get some questions answered in our remaining time. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Langford. Those pictures crack me up. My hair is gray also. So, yes, it's been an amazing 30 years. So thank you for all your work. I'm going to turn the podium over to Kaylin Young, our network manager for the V-PPRN, and to Ed Becker, our director of marketing and communications. They're going to coordinate the Q&A session. Before we start the Q&A, I wanted to point out that earlier we posted in the handout section our 2016 vasculitis awareness poster and also a brochure on vasculitis. You can download both of these posters to distribute or to hand out via or to send out via your social media channels. So again, Kaylin and Ed, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Joyce, and thank you, Dr. Langford. So we have several questions, and thank you all so much for submitting your questions in the question box. Please note that during the rest of the remaining time in Q&A, you can submit your questions using your navigation bar. There should be a tab for submitting questions, and we'll receive them and try and answer as many as we can during the Q&A. Any additional questions that we aren't able to get to because of time restraints, we will email to Dr. Langford and hopefully be able to share out some of the responses to those. Again, I would just like to reiterate that these questions should be more general. We can't answer personal health questions, but we are more than happy to try and answer any of your general questions or about vasculitis research over the past 30 years. So this is an interesting question. We actually received this quite a bit. It's referring to GPA patients, but I think it could be applied to all the vasculitides. And the question is, if you are someone in your 20s or you were diagnosed younger, is there a future in which you don't have to be on maintenance therapy for the rest of your life? Or is it possible to one day be off all maintenance treatments without relapse?
Yeah, so I think this is an important question, and I similarly do get this from people not just in their 20s, but people really throughout the spectrum of age as far as, does this mean that I'm going to need to be on something for the rest of my life? And the answer right now is that, you know, not necessarily, and again, there are two different aspects of this. One is that in current day, there are certain settings and individuals where they may not need to be on maintenance medication. This is, again, individually based, and there are many people as of right now, based upon what we know about vasculitis and its relapsing nature, that maintenance medication continuation continues to be the best choice in terms of lessening the risk of relapse and the potential for organ damage. But again, that's made on an individual basis between the person and their physician based upon their individual type of vasculitis, what areas they've had affected, and if they've had previous relapses. But that also doesn't take into account as far as what this may mean for the future. And one of the things I hope to share as far as with this timeline is within a relatively short period of time, how we've approached treatment has changed. I don't think that when I first started in this area, I could have ever envisioned having something quite like Rituximab, or that we would be looking at some of these other agents. And so in moving ahead in the future, as new treatments become available and as our understanding about the immune system and the causes of vasculitis comes into place, that may mean something very different in terms of how we approach maintenance and how this is viewed from the standpoint of each individual and their potential profile. So again, I think that this is still a moving question. There are certain parts we can't answer, but at this point, we always say there are no always and nevers in medicine. And again, I don't think that we would ever necessarily say you should plan on being something for the rest of your life, because this will continue to evolve over time.
Great, thank you. And so actually it kind of leads into some of the next questions. There are several here about Rituximab. So the first is, again, it's referring to GPA patients, but I think we could apply it across the vasculitides for those that are treated with Rituximab. Are there current statistics of relapse rates when using Rituximab as maintenance therapy? And then the second question, kind of pertaining to Rituximab as well, is Rituximab maintenance therapy superior to cell set maintenance?
Okay. So when we're talking about Rituximab, again, even though we do want to try and keep this general to all forms of vasculitis, we do need to make sure we recognize that this is really applied to those illnesses where this has been studied. So although this has been very effective and, as I mentioned, FDA approved for GPA and MPA, this is not the case for other forms of vasculitis such as giant cell arteritis. So we can't extrapolate when a medication has been effective in one form of vasculitis that it will be effective in another without study. In terms of the maintenance question, from the original study that was done as far as with the RAVE trial, where this was followed over time, these individuals were initially treated either with one course of Rituximab or with cyclophosphamide going to azathioprine. And with this one course of Rituximab, although we did see that there was no difference in the occurrence of relapse compared with cyclophosphamide to azathioprine, relapse did indeed still occur, demonstrating to us that we need to continue to have a plan for what we're going to do for maintenance after Rituximab treatment. At this point in time, there are options that we do consider in each individual, which is in certain instances we may follow people along and continue to see how they do, and then decide to treat and should a relapse occur. I would say that's still the minority of people, but that remains an option for certain individuals. Otherwise, we may consider as far as the use of a conventional medication such as methotrexate, azathioprine, or mycophenolate, which is Abatacept. Or we may consider the use of Rituximab as its own maintenance medication, where currently the schedule has largely been based upon giving smaller doses about every 6 months. This was the focus of an important study conducted over in France that had examined Rituximab maintenance compared to azathioprine or Imuran after Cytoxan induction. And within the scope of how long this study was conducted, Rituximab appeared to have a slightly lower rate of relapse. Now, the issues with this remain that this is still capturing a relatively short period of time, and as I mentioned, these are now very long-term illnesses such that we have to think about how we're going to move ahead in looking years into the future. Such that, again, right now, the decision about whether to use rituximab versus conventional agents, and if we are to use rituximab, how long that could be continued for, remains very individualized. The second question about comparison as far as rituximab versus CellCept, that has not been investigated. The only comparative study with the use of CellCept was that comparing it to azathioprine Imuran, in which there did appear to be a slightly higher rate of relapse with CellCept as compared to azathioprine, although this can again continue to maintain remission in a number of people, such that this can be a very valuable and effective medicine, particularly for people who have either had side effects or relapses through methotrexate or Imuran.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question we have is, sorry, let me scroll down a bit. Well, and it kind of, again, is related, but, and this I think is an exceptional question because it involves all of our participants as well as researchers, investigators. But what do we need to do to accelerate progress towards a cure? In a nutshell.
I mean, I think, again, the strategies that I mentioned at the very end are really where that focus is, as far as having investigators both within the laboratory and within the clinical realm that are continuing to look at these, the importance of participation in research, certainly as that individual feels to be appropriate for them. Trying to, again, advocate for funding at whatever levels that be with the government through, again, other venues. The training of bright new minds who will bring new ideas to the table, and will also, be additional people to participate. And that includes, as far as the work that's going on, with Vasculitis Foundation and the VCRC, to train people who will be going out to places that don't currently have vasculitis centers, both as partners in taking care of people and partners in research. And again, just work that is going on without the field. And really just, we have always, we'll always learn from others. That's very important as well. And we are continuing to see advancements in immunology, in other disease areas that are going to shed light on what we may learn in vasculitis. So I think continuing to push ahead and advancing all of those areas is where our next ideas and our next advancements are going to come.
Great, thank you. And then today we have, let's see, oh, it's no longer, another question. Ed, did you have any questions that were submitted prior to the webinar?
Yeah, we actually have a few questions that came in over Facebook. The first one, the person says, this may sound like a chicken or the egg question, but what would be considered more important? Research into better diagnostics and quicker diagnosis, or treatment once the diagnosis has been made, and looking at other types of treatment? Do you think one is more important than the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard to prioritize or say that one is more important than the other, and in certain ways those are interrelated. I think that we recognize that early diagnosis is very important, and that is something that certainly we have heard from people and their families, and that is something that we have continued to focus on in terms of education, getting the word out, and again, Vasculitis Foundation has really led the way in those efforts also. Some of the means as far as thinking about diagnostic tools gets not only to some of the things that we're using currently, but what the future may hold as far as are there what we could determine as far as what are called biomarkers that may identify either an individual who we should be much more strongly suspecting as far as a vasculitis, if they are having certain features that could be within that. And that in turn does also have links as far as how we think about treatment and being able to assess response to treatment. So when we've talked about as far as the disease instruments that we have as far as trying to determine disease activity, remission, and relapse, there are certain things, again, that we recognize are pretty straightforward. But there are also things that we recognize are not. And for people often that have more large vessel vasculitis, giant cell arteritis, and Takayasu arteritis, trying to determine active disease versus damage can be one of the greatest challenges. And this is where, again, the study of these biomarkers, which may be blood tests, they may be imaging tests, they may be other types of studies that may be able to shed light on this. So although these are both very important facets, in many ways they are interrelated in getting back to some of the core concepts of what are we understanding in terms of immunology, potential triggers, and how might that influence what we are able to look at and design in terms of treatment.
Thank you. The second one, the person said that they, I guess, previously saw a webinar that we had done, and it was about the microbiome. And I guess what stuck with this person, according to their question, is that this was the really hot new area of research for vasculitis, and just wonder if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, the microbiome again refers to that we don't live in this world alone. We share this with many microorganisms that are a part of our world and are actually a part of us, and that we know that there are, again, very helpful bacteria that are important to us in terms of that help us digest our food, that are part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. What we've increasingly recognized is these are not just living with us, but are actually a part of us. And this has been a very emerging field in really all aspects of medicine, and trying to understand the interrelated role of how what goes on within our bodies is related to our relationship with these organisms that are a part of us, and how and if this may trigger a diverse range of different illnesses. This is an area that, again, there has been ongoing work within the vasculitis field, and I think we're going to continue to see these studies continuing to emerge. And again, this gets to the idea similarly that this didn't necessarily begin in vasculitis, but we recognized the importance of this work such that we took these ideas and led to the questions about, well, what does this mean for the vasculitis world, and are there things that we can learn from this, and what could this shed light on what the causes of these illnesses are, and how does this lead us to our ultimate goals?
Thank you. So the last question is kind of interesting, and you alluded to it earlier. It's apparently from someone who is studying in going to medical school. They're asking, what are some of the challenges and issues about rheumatology and attracting new talent, excuse me, and new people into the field of rheumatology?
Yeah, so first, as you sort of saw from some of the highlights, rheumatology is very often, as far as a specialty that vasculitis will fall under, but it's by no means the only one. Some of the scientists I show you today were very prominent not only within vasculitis, but in other fields, including nephrology, which is kidney diseases, pulmonology, or respiratory diseases. And again, we couldn't do what we do without neurologists, dermatologists, surgeons. So there are a diverse range of medical specialists who can and do contribute to what we do in vasculitis. So I by no means want to just limit this to rheumatology. But I think, again, for a young person, as far as, I don't think any of us are, ignorant to the fact that there are a lot of changes that have occurred in medicine over the course of time. And those are going to continue for the future. I think what change is, the curiosity, the excitement, the ability to contribute and make a difference in lives that a career in medicine can offer. There's all sorts of professions that can make a difference. Medicine is one of those. And I think that we need to continue to focus on those individuals, and they will continue to be there. We're not going to lose the interest of our bright youth who really want to find a field in medicine. And I think, again, with the work as far as with what the Vasculitis Foundation and what our networks have done as far as trying to reach out to people who are early in their careers. So as an example, I give to our medical students about vasculitis. And again, this is duplicated, I know, by colleagues that do the same thing at their institution to get them interested in these illnesses at an early point and try and get them directed into thinking about these diseases as far as, again, early diagnosis and the potential excitement and rewarding of being able to pursue a career in these areas. So again, I don't think we're going to lose our bright young minds. I think they're there, and again, it's through organizations like the Vasculitis Foundation that we're going to continue to cultivate them, to be able to expand their minds and really direct them into working in vasculitis and leading our next discoveries.
Okay, thank you very much. Kaylin, back to you.
Great. So I think we're getting close to wrapping up, but I have saved the questions that we did not get to. Several of them were about side effects of particular medications, which I think is good information for us as the Vasculitis Foundation to keep as well for future webinar topics, so that maybe we can address medication side effects more directly in a specific webinar, but we will get back to those questions. And I would just like to say thank you again, Dr. Langford, for a wonderful presentation, and we as well are looking forward to the next 30 years. Joyce?
Great. Thank you, Kaylin and Ed, and thank you again, Dr. Langford, for your presentation and all your work over the past 22, 30 years. It's been amazing. So I just wanted to let everyone know that our next webinar is going to be on May 18th, and this summer we're doing something a little bit different. We're adding disease-specific webinars where we'll be focusing, the webinar will focus on a specific form of vasculitis. So we're setting those up right now. Our first one's on May 18th, and will feature Dr. Yusuf Yeksi, the director of the New York Langone-Behçet Syndrome Center. He will be discussing Behçet's. Many of you who are Behçet's patients know him. He provides amazing patient care and is a great researcher. So on May 18th, we hope you will join us for that webinar. And then we'll be announcing the other webinars as we get them set up. Again, I wanted to thank all of you for attending, and just to remind you that May is Vasculitis Awareness Month. We do believe everyone should know about vasculitis, so whatever you can do to help raise awareness of the impact the disease has on our patients' lives and the lives of their families, that would be great. And thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.